So this will be the last demonstration for the dress before it's due. Today we're going to do the hems. We have two separate hems, one for the lining and then one for the shell of the garment. And then we'll do something called a swing tack, which tacks those two layers together at the hem to make sure that your lining doesn't ride up as you're wearing the garment. So we'll go ahead and switch over to our other camera and get started today. Okay, so I've got my dress here with my lining and my shell, and we need to hem both of these pieces of fabric. So the first one we're gonna do today is the lining. I'm just gonna take this shell and push it up into the dress so that it's out of the way. And now I've just got my lining sticking off the bottom by itself. The way we're going to hem this one is we're going to turn it to the wrong side twice, and then we'll top stitch it. So this should look very similar to what we did with the narrow hem last semester on that curved sample. But instead of doing it at 1/8 of an inch, we'll do it at 1/4. So the first step that we need to do is we're going to take this over to our sewing machine, and we're going to create a 1/4 inch basting line all the way around the hem. And that'll be our guide for whenever we fold this up and press it. So let's go ahead and take this over to our sewing machine and we'll put in that basting guide first. Come over here. Okay, so I'm going to switch up my stitch length from a 2.5 up to a 4 for that basting stitch. And then I'm just going to place my fabric right at that 1/4 inch marking that is on my foot. And we'll baste all the way around. And this is just through a single layer. So try and get this basting as even a measurement as possible, because this will determine the width of your final hem. Okay, when you go over those seams, make sure they stay busted open. Okay, and there's no need to back stitch on either of those because that is a temporary stitch. So let's go ahead and go press this on our ironing board. Okay, so I'm gonna look at the wrong side of my fabric. So I'm gonna look at the inside of this garment area, and we're gonna start pressing this up. Here we go. So right at that basting line, I'm just gonna fold up my fabric, and this is towards the inside of the lining area. So you should see the seam allowances. We're just gonna press that all the way around, and then we'll come back and we'll do that a second time so that in the end, we're folding it up twice and we're covering up those raw edges. Just cutting off my little thread tails as I go. Okay, so that's one full circumference of the skirt. Now I'm going to go ahead and press it up a second time. And I'm pressing it right at that raw edge that I pressed up. So this should be another 1/4 inch that you're pressing up. And it should be very even in width the whole way around. And this time I'm going to pin as I go, because this will be where we ultimately stitch. So if you've done your basting line really nice and even during that first step, then you shouldn't really have to use your ruler to measure and make sure that this is an even width the whole way. But if it's looking uneven at all to you, definitely use your ruler and make sure that you're pressing it a consistent 1/4 inch. And we know we're not twisting our hem. Whenever we cross over those seams, they should still fold up and match perfectly with the seam above it. So that's a good way to double check that you're not accidentally shifting your hem to the left or the right, which is called twisting. Sorry, I've rotated this so many times, I've got it all bunched up at the top. There we go. But that's called twisting. So if I see any of that where it kind of ends up with these diagonal lines showing in your hem, then I'll know that you accidentally shifted it left or right as you are pressing. Through. Okay, so again, here at the seam, my little seam on my hem is matching up with the seam on the rest of my dress. Now we're going to take this over to our sewing machine and we're going to do a top stitch. So on the outside of our skirt hem, it'll just look like a 1/4 inch stitch away from the folded edge. And on the inside, it should catch that hem right on that inside folded edge, not on the outside edge. Okay, so let's go ahead and go do the top stitch. Okay, so I like to do this step from the outside of my dress. So we pressed and everything on the inside, but we want that stitch line to be really even with the very bottom of our dress, that folded edge. And we want it to be a consistent 1/4 inch over. So there's a little bit less to look at, and it's easier to line it up with that bottom edge if we're looking at the outside that's a little bit cleaner rather than the inside where you have all that folded area. So I'm just gonna pick a seam to start at, line up the folded edge with the 1/4 inch marking on my machine, and then we'll just go ahead and start top stitching. Make sure, if you haven't already, that your stitch length is back down to a 2.5 because we don't want to do this with a basting stitch. And again, with lining, it's really good to keep it taut. So I like to put one hand in front, one hand in back, and I'm not pulling it through my machine. So my back hand is not pulling on it. I'm just kind of keeping it up and keeping it taut. And then we're going to connect back to our stitch line on the other side when we finish. Back stitch, and then we're done. So there's our hem from the outside, a really nice even 1/4 inch. And then from the inside, I can flip that, there we go. It looks like an edge stitch on the edge of that folded hem. Okay, let's go over, we'll clean this up, and then we'll start doing the hem for the shell. Okay, so over here, I'm just gonna clean up any of those threads that may still be hanging off. If you have any frayed edges of your lining that you need to trim up, so like these little frayed edges, you can trim all those up before you move on. Okay, now we're going to single out that shell lining shell hem. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So right now our shell is all stuffed up in our lining. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and pull it back down so we can see it. I'll push my lining up out of the way. And now we're going to fold and press this hem area of the shell of our dress. So for this one, it has a notch on the seams where that hem is supposed to get folded up. So if I fold right on that, it should be 1.5 inches that's being pressed up. Let me get my ruler real quick. So 1.5 inches right there. So that's how much we're pressing up. So I'm going to go ahead and start at one of those seams and I'll press up that much. And then I want to get that a consistent measurement throughout the whole dress. So I am going to use my ruler on this one since we don't have that stitch guide. So you can see I'm doing the seam areas first, and then I kind of come back and in between those and press the middle. Trim off any threads you have hanging off. Okay, next thing we're going to do is press under that raw edge. So we've got our raw edge here still showing at the top. We need to get rid of that. So we're going to press that under 1/4 inch. So what we should have left here is 1.25 inches. So I'm going to go to that measurement and start working my way back around, folding under that 1/4 inch. And again, I like to go to the seams first, and then I can come back to this in-between area and press that. This in-between area is pretty big, so I'm going to measure again in the middle just to make sure it's consistent. These sewing gauges, which is this little miniature ruler that I'm using with the little sliding feature on it. These are really nice for hems because you can set that little slide at the measurement that you need. So right now I'm doing 1.25 inches. And it means I don't have to go back and look at the measurements on my ruler. If I was just using a regular ruler, I would have to find that 1.25 inches every time. But it just makes it a little bit quicker if you've got that gauge and it's stuck at the measurement that you need. So those were not required. I think it was suggested last semester on your supply list, but it wasn't required. It's just a thing that makes your life a little easier. I think this is our last little section here. Okay, now in order to do that machine stitched blind stitch, we need to fold back this hem. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've got the hem fully pressed here, I'm going to fold it under towards the right side of the fabric. And I just want that 1/4 inch that we just folded back sticking off. And for this one, we're not going to press it because we don't want that crease permanently in there. So this is my hem right here. Fold back that hem until I just have that 1/4 inch sticking off. The fold should be right up next to the raw edge. I'm gonna see if I can put this down on the table so I can pin it. Okay, so fold back that hem and you'll see my folded edge is right next to the raw edge of that 1/4 inch. And I'm going to pin that, but not press it. We need to do that around the whole hem. think we're about 2/3 of the way. This takes time when you're trying to keep it all on camera. There we go. Okay, now we're going to take this over to our machine and we're going to do that blind stitch with our foot. So we will be stitching over here on this part that's sticking off. And then every once in a while, our stitch will jump over to the main part of our dress to catch it. So let's go ahead and go over to our machine and we'll do that machine stitch with the blind foot. Okay. So again, I'm going to switch off to my blind hem foot. So should look something like this where it has that kind of bar, oops, excuse me, that metal bar going down the center of the foot. And that bar is what helps it catch both sides of your garment. So I'm going to pick a seam to start with. I need to make sure on my machine that I switch over to the blind hem stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and press that. So I'm not just doing a basic straight stitch anymore. And then again, I usually just pick a seam to start at. That bar at the center of the foot needs to go right against the folded edge of my hem. And it'll act as a guide. I'm going to do my back stitch, which for this one, most of the time is just a stitch in place like that. And then once you're finished with your back stitch, you'll go ahead and follow along. So just use that bar that's in the middle of your foot as a guide to keep it even with the folded edge of your hem right there. Okay, let's head back to our ironing board again. Okay, back over here, just trim up any threads that you have hanging off from that stitch. And then from the outside of the dress, so I'm gonna look at the right side of my fabric, I should fold down or unfold, I guess, that hem, and it should be completely flat. There shouldn't be any crease or seam right here where we stitched. Those stitches, the little triangle, the tip of the triangle, whenever you unfold it, should stretch out a little bit and should look like little vertical lines. So make sure you fully unfold. That was one thing that I saw in the notebooks. We had some people who just kind of partially unfolded. And so it looked like there was this kind of fold or crease still at that stitch line. So make sure you fully unfold it and then press it nice and flat. Does anyone have a question right now? Okay, so once you get that fully done, then we are going to do our swing tacks, which will be the very last step. So go ahead and let your lining down. So once you've got all that done, let me get all this untwisted from whenever I was rotating it. So make sure everything is fully untwisted on the inside of your dress. There we go. And then you'll notice that your lining should be sitting right at the top of that hem area. So we don't want our lining as long as the shell of the dress, because then we run the risk of it peeking out from the bottom. So what I want to do is let this lay nice and flat. From my seams, what I usually do, so this is center back seam here from the zipper down. I like to kind of smooth that out and make sure that that lining is laying nice and flat with the shell, because on your swing tacks, what you don't want to do is accidentally pull your lining too far down, because then when you put it on, it's going to make the dress kind of bunch up and pick up. So you want to just make sure that the lining is laying nice and smooth and flat, and that it's hitting right at the top of your hem area. And then only at the side seams, we're going to do little swing tacks. So for the swing tack, I would suggest using a thicker thread. Last semester, we used heavy duty thread for the denim sample. So if you have any of that left over, that would be a good suggestion. You can even go up as thick as, this is called embroidery floss, and it's sold in bundles. So it's usually, let me see, it's usually wound like this, where it's this long bundle. So this is embroidery floss. I'm using this because it's really thick, so it'll be easy to see on camera. But you don't have to use something this thick. You can just use your heavy duty thread. if you don't have this, or if you don't want to go purchase it. This stuff is like 90, I think it's like 90 cents for a bundle of it at Joann's or Hobby Lobby or wherever. Okay, so I'm gonna get my needle, and if you have a thicker thread, you may need to pick a needle with a larger hole so that you can fit your thread through that. So I'm gonna pick this needle, get it threaded. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is on the inside, in between these two layers, we're going to put a little tack to hold them together. But instead of just stitching them directly touching each other, we're going to leave a little gap so that they can move. So that's why it's called a swing tack, because that gap in between allows your lining to shift and move with your body. But it will kind of tack it down so that your lining doesn't ride up as you're wearing your garment. So this is the side seam right here of my dress. And I'll just do one today, again, to save time, but you'll do one on either. I'm going to pick this up so that I can see the seam allowances, and that's where we're actually going to stitch it. So I'm going to start right here on the seam, stitch in place. Oh, it came out. There we go. Stitch in place once or twice, or maybe more than that, to get it to stay. This is really thick thread, but I wanted y'all to be able to see what was happening. Okay, let me cut off this little tail. There we go. Okay, and then I'm going to leave about an inch gap, and I'm gonna do a stitch in place on this other side for my shell as well. And this should just be going through that hem. It shouldn't go all the way to the front of the garment. I don't want to see it on the outside. So just through that hem layer. And then I'm going to pull it until I've got about an inch gap. And then I'm going to stitch in place here so that I can secure that inch. Okay, and then what we're going to do, if you've ever done a friendship bracelet, what we're going to do is this gap, we're going to wrap it in thread to strengthen it. So I'm going to go back up to the top so I can work from the top down. This needle is so thick, it doesn't want to go through my fabric very easily. Come on, there we go. Okay, so I've got my inch gap, and then I'm going to go ahead and take my needle off just so I don't poke myself. But what I'm going to do is place this tail over to the right-hand side and then make a loop on that right-hand side. So the tail is going to go behind the 1 inch gap. So now I've got a loop over to the right, and I'm going to go through that loop with the tail of my thread. So if you've ever, like I said, if you've ever made friendship bracelets, this should look pretty familiar. Pull that tight, and then you're going to push it up to the top. And you're going to keep doing that until you cover that entire gap. So again, the tail goes behind. I've got it held over here on the right-hand side with my finger. Tail goes behind, over to the left, and then through the loop. And then pull that loop closed and push it up to the top and make sure it's nice and tight. So I'll do a few more of those. And this is why I said thicker thread is better, because this part goes a lot faster with thicker thread. You can use regular machine thread or serger thread. But if you do, those threads are just a lot skinnier. So this part where you're trying to fill up that entire gap takes a lot longer. So if you're looking for it to not take as long, I would suggest buying a thicker thread or finding one. Okay, so tail goes behind, loop over on the right, and then tail goes through the loop. and then push it tight, and you'll see it starts to stack up these little knots at the top. And so those knots, you want to go all the way down to the bottom. And then once you get down to the bottom, you'll just put your needle back on the tail, and you can stitch in place down here at the bottom to secure it, and then you'll be done. So that is your swing tack. And again, that allows your lining to shift, but not to pull up. So this one is completely done. I've filled it up with knots all the way down to the bottom. And now I've got my tail that's just hanging out here. I'm gonna put that tail back on my needle. Let me grab my needle. Okay, so put that tail back on my needle, and then to finish it off, I'm just gonna stitch in place down here at the bottom again through that hem layer. This needle is pretty thick, so it gets stuck in the fabric. There we go. Come on. There we go. So you can do that a couple of times just to tie off. There we go. Okay, and then when you're totally done, just cut off, and there's your swing tack.